Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. So this is a joint UKAS and HSE webinar where we'll be discussing our proposed deviation from the 2-point NAD methodology that is currently in HSG 248. So I'd just like to introduce everyone that is here today. So we have our contacts from HSE that are Moya Woolley, who is the asbestos policy team leader, Laurie Davies, who is a technical team lead for the fibres and minerals, and also Martin Saunders, who is the senior scientist in the health exposure control group. So joining myself from UKAS point of view today, I am here as the head of the Agri, Food, Life Sciences and Asbestos Department, which is titled AFLA, and also I have my operations specialist Andy Ward, who will be managing some of the questions in the background for you, and also Louise Wainwright, that I'm sure a lot of people will know as our technical lead for the asbestos area in UKAS. So just to explain for today, we do have a short presentation to cover this area and the themes that have been commonly discussed. But also we do have an area, the Q&A area, that is for questions that you are welcome to pose throughout the webinar. Please do not pose any questions into the chat function because we cannot monitor that in the same way that we can monitor our Q&A, and we want to enable us to answer as many questions as possible for you all. We will be producing a Q&A that will be published on our website as a written document after this webinar. And then can I ask you that you do ask questions that are related to this topic and not wider across asbestos, just so we can get to all of the areas and queries that people have around this topic today. And we will also be putting this webinar as a recording onto our website, so that will be available. We hope that will be just later this week. So just to cover what we'll be looking at today, we will be going briefly over the background for the 2-point NAD methodology, looking at the evaluating and agreeing of the categories of materials and how we got to those categories, and also explaining a bit more detail around the extension scope process and how we'll be managing that for this deviating methodology. And then we will go into the live Q&A session. So I'd like to hand over now to my HSE colleagues on this call.
Okay, thanks, Juliet. It's Laurie Davies here. So I want to start off just by giving a little bit of background, not too much detail on how we got to where we are now. So the first edition of HSG 248, published in 2005, got to the point where it was needed to be updated to reflect changes both in the control of asbestos regulations, but also some work that HSE carried out called the Analyst project, which looked at a whole range of different aspects of 4-stage clearances, testing, sampling, analysis, etc. So the findings of that fed into the new draft, as it was at the time, draft version of HSG 248. And this initial draft, then called the second edition, went out for an initial public consultation in around about 2015-16. During this consultation process, various changes were introduced to the draft document, and particularly in relation to this webinar today, to address concerns which were raised around the reporting of false negative samples during analysis. And this was highlighted to HSE during a UKAS asbestos technical assessor meeting where the feedback was that these sort of false negatives have been reported or have been witnessed, and so it was recommended to HSE that this change was made. So when the document was published in 2021, we received feedback that the proposals, all these changes, had not been fully discussed during scheduled industry meetings or cascaded sufficiently to allow feedback input into the changes. So whilst there was some feedback after the initial consultation, this was not a full public consultation, and the industry representatives that were present and had prior sight of the document felt that this was insufficient for the wider asbestos industry. So this approach that we're talking about today, this deviating method from HSG 248, was developed to help address this point. Could I have the next slide, please, Juliet? So UKAS has a technical advisory committee, which is made up of stakeholders, HSE representatives, and obviously UKAS themselves. And the issues and challenges presented by the second edition of HSG 248, particularly in Table A210, were discussed at great length during several UKAS TAC meetings. We found that we couldn't really get agreement on the way forward during these meetings, and it was decided that stakeholders, namely accredited asbestos laboratories, would be invited to submit an alternative proposal or alternative proposals to the method published in HSG 248. And at that time, several of these alternative proposals were received. So these were reviewed by HSE and UKAS, and we deemed that none of them were really acceptable to HSE, and this was either because they referenced the return to the first edition of HSG 248, i.e. no particular change, or the changes proposed were not sufficiently rigorous to give us the confidence that the analysis that would be undertaken would be fit for purpose. So in the absence of a viable alternative, HSE, or we devised our own version of what we think would be acceptable, certainly to us, and hopefully to the wider asbestos industry. And this was discussed at a further UKAS TAC meeting. Following on from this, it was decided that more consultation was needed, so a joint HSE UKAS workshop was hosted in Buxton by HSE, in which invited stakeholders were came to put forward their views, and there was some representation from industry groups and independent laboratories as well. So following that workshop, the revised table or approach went through several iterations with input from stakeholders, mainly those contributing from UKAS TAC and also within HSE itself. And after this process, the final agreed, or maybe not agreed, but the final version of the document from which HSE decided that this was as far as we were prepared to go in terms of changes, and this is where this final version was produced. Have the next slide, please, Juliet. So just a bit of background to the HSE position on this. So the table and supporting information that will provide this alternative approach to samples with no asbestos detected must be added to HSG 248 guidance before UKAS can begin to start any process for extensions to scope or applications for this alternative approach. And just so that everyone is aware in advance that the availability of publishing slots within HSE for updating guidance are rare and difficult to get hold of. These are normally planned several years in advance, and based on review dates, this will determine when the guidance can be amended. Now, unfortunately, in the case of this particular change, because it's the insertion of a complete table, that's adding one page, which means all of the subsequent pages and references would be affected. So it's not just a trivial task of adding one page or one table. There's a knock-on effect with cross-references across different sections and page numbers. So that's something that we should all be aware of before we go any further. And we also like to point out that the HSE has agreed to this alternative approach on a trial basis. So if we find that the criteria for accreditation are not met, or there are other unforeseen difficulties which arise from the introduction of this alternative approach, then it may be that HSE could or may withdraw this alternative approach if we deem that hasn't really worked to our satisfaction. Next slide, please. I'll pass on to whoever's.
Oh yeah, that's the end of your slides, Laurie. Thank you very much. So I just want to pick up here and take you through this process, which is the UKAS outline of the extension to scope process that would be applicable for achieving accreditation for this alternative approach. So obviously the first step would be that laboratory would need to review and understand the requirements for this alternative approach, and then they would need to be able to justify and look at the basis of their how they're going to control the analyst judgment and the details they need to provide around the sample when they take those samples in. So obviously, as Laurie just said, we would need this in the publication for it to be in there, but there's nothing obviously, if this is agreed, to stop a laboratory looking at how that would actually fit within their business. And then to do that, the step would be to actually complete a gap analysis that will see what a laboratory has in place, what needs to be addressed, and then document addressing those gaps. So this would all need to be put in place and be there ready to show how it meet all of these requirements. We've mentioned this will be an extension to scope process. There will be a dedicated UKAS declaration. This will be very similar to the declaration that was submitted for version 1 to version 2 of 248, but it will be specifically for this application, and it will need to have an AC4 form, but UKAS are considering making that a template to make it easier to ensure you are applying for the appropriate wording, not that anything would actually be changing on any UKAS schedule whatsoever, and there'd be absolutely no marketing allowed at all of this process. But those documents would all be submitted for an extension to scope. And then there would be a desktop assessment of that from the laboratories that have been submitted. This has been discussed in depth with quite a lot of different stakeholders and was discussed at the TAC. We understand, obviously, there is a slight chicken and egg situation that you will not be able to conduct this testing until you have your accreditation. So you cannot actually do it until you have the accreditation, but you would need to have a full process, procedures, records and controls in place to allow you to implement that as soon as there would be any grant of accreditation. So we have decided it would be a desktop assessment at this point with a post-grant site assessment. The time lines for reviewing the desktop assessment will be dependent on assessor availability and may or may not result in a positive recommendation depending on the contents of that extension to scope. If there are any non-conformities, they would be raised as normal as a UKAS finding, and they would be closed in the normal process that is in place through our portal for corrective actions. This would go through as any other extension scope. The UKAS process has 2 stages of independent review, one being the report and any findings that are raised to ensure that it does cover the scope that's being applied for and that suitable assessment has been conducted, and then a final review, which is the closing out of any findings and any post-grant activities, which in this case would be a site assessment, the effort required for that, and how that would be carried out. So this is the overall extension to scope process that is in place regarding the site assessments. UKAS policy for anything that does require a post-grant is usually within 3 months of an assessment, but there would be some sensible flexibility around any upcoming visits or anything that was already scheduled for any organisation. So that's the overall process, and I'd just like to finish off with a couple of points I think are important to consider. And just to put in mind with this process, which may be a little different to a lot of other things that are in the asbestos accreditation arena, is that the controls, the processes, records, and the consistency assurance must come from the laboratory and what will work within their business, within their setup, depending on a lot of different factors and how they work. And UKAS must be very careful not to give consultancy on any of these processes. We will, however, as I mentioned, look at any kind of templates or documents that could assist laboratories in being successful at submitting this extension to scope. So it does become very important that the details you get from a sample submitter, so whether that's your own organisation surveyors or other surveyors or general samples being taken, that information that comes with that sample becomes a really important piece of information, and the details that are required with that, as well as the any queries or any doubts that would need to be addressed, would have to be documented and be in place and agreed before any analysis starts. And I think a big question that may come out is around quality assurance. And the quality assurance required for this may vary slightly depending on the laboratory, the business you have, the sample types you receive, and the analysts, the number and the type of experience they have that are involved in this. So it all needs to be justified within your extension to scope process, and maybe something that does need to develop as this kind of methodology does settle into the accredited laboratory. Just to confirm that UKAS will be gathering additional statistics, and we will do this through our annual universal declaration that ideally is completed about six to 8 weeks before any assessment we actually conduct. And to highlight that there will be additional site effort required annually on an ongoing basis for any laboratory that does take up this option, because it will be another area and another process that will be assessed on an annual basis. The amount of the effort that this would be will vary, and that will be dependent upon the number of analysts, the samples per month, the variety of samples, and the ease of assessing that process. But that would all be something that will be given as estimates in a normal process. And just to highlight, as we've already mentioned, that the changes and the sufficient uptake of this needs to be in place to really drive a change to 248 for HSE, to feel confident that it's appropriate to change the documentation and the publication where that is. So I'd like to move on now to the live Q&A session in the area now, and just to confirm, we cannot facilitate live discussion on here. I say we will be taking the questions from the Q&A area of this webinar, and then addressing them with the panel that are here, but we will be having an output. And just to remind you, if you aren't choosing to stay right to the end of the Q&A, that the expression of interest is out on the UKAS website for return. Please be very careful of the details that we've asked that will need to be returned with that, because we do need those specific details we've requested with your expression of interest to get a little bit more of an idea of the activities within your laboratory, the size of your laboratories. But that this expression of interest at this moment would be looking for an extension to scope application to be ready, possibly looking at the next sort of 3 to 5 months, depending on timescales. And just to make everyone aware that any extension scope application that is in does result in a half-a-day effort charge that is non-refundable for UKAS extension scope policies, as all extensions to scope. So to facilitate this Q&A, I will stop this presentation, and I'm going to ask that Andy can facilitate some questions, and that I can aim them to appropriate colleagues.
Yeah, thanks for that, Juliet. We've got nothing in the Q&A at the moment.
Okay, so bearing in mind, anyone on this call, if you would like to put anything into the Q&A resulting from that presentation, any questions that might have sparked?
Okay, we've got two in there now. The first one, what specifically is the change/deviation to the method?
So the methods and the changes were all put within the expression of interest document. So if you would like to see that in more detail, it's fully set out as the proposal is within the expression of interest on the UKAS website and the document embedded within that. But Laurie, do you want to just give a couple of words summary really on where it's trying to go?
Yeah, happy to do that. So the fundamental main difference is that the revised table which will be an alternative to existing table A 2.7, I think it is, just allows the analysis of some samples which don't contain asbestos if they are materials which are known not to contain asbestos, and they would go through as 1 point rather than 2 points, where the current version of 248 kind of says all non-asbestos detected samples are counted as 2 points. So obvious materials that are known not to contain asbestos, they would go through as 1 point, and that's the main difference. There's a few other things in there, but to describe very briefly, that is it.
Lovely, thank you, Laurie.
There's another similar question there around committing to an extension to scope without knowing what the final changes to the document will be. But I think as you've said there and explained, Laurie and Juliet, that information is already in the public domain around what the change is.
Yeah, the changes that UKAS have put out in the expression of interest, they won't change it.
That's it.
So that's the agreed final version.
Sorry. And then there's a question here which is probably best directed to UKAS on this one, and again I guess the HSE may want to comment with regards to what constitutes sufficient uptake and what would the minimum number of labs be.
So I don't think it's about a minimum number of labs, because the thing is we have a huge variety of laboratories as to what they do and how that is. So it really is an overall review of what the participants that have applied for it, what impact that would have on the industry. So it's more of an overall review that we will be doing together, because we have to balance the fact that we have to have the available resources to continue everything else and all the other extensions to scope that any other asbestos laboratory might need to do, that UKAS needs to obviously continue to move in an appropriately timely manner. So I think that there is we need to have a certain number of labs, because it will have to look at what the labs do, what impact they have, and that's why we have asked additional questions. Very normally in this kind of situation with expression of interest, UKAS would just ask for the kind of organisation. Maybe we needed to ask more detail, because we will need to have a more holistic kind of view as to whether it would be beneficial to the entire industry. I don't know if HSE have any other comment.
I think you've covered exactly what HSE would have said, Juliet. Thanks.
Lovely.
Okay, another similar one around whether HSG 248 would need to be reissued prior to UKAS offering accreditation.
Absolutely.
Which I think
I think I've already confirmed that is the case. So yes, we'd have to add the new table alongside the existing table. So that would be an amendment to the document and then have to be republished.
Yeah, and from UKAS's point of view, obviously we need that out in regulation, and what that would look like. Again, while I say that obviously if UKAS, the HSE guidance document changes, and it has a slight update, say instead of 2 it's 2.1, I'm not saying that is the case, but we would obviously need to reflect that in all schedules. Everyone will be exactly the same in UKAS schedules, whether you are doing that deviating process or not. There will be absolutely no difference in the marketplace. You'll be not allowed to advertise that as an additional or any kind of different service. There'll be nothing in reports. This will be very much you as a laboratory will make the decision as to what is the most appropriate for that sample type. to actually analyse that with, and the output customers will see exactly the same assurance and following exactly the same HSE document as they should be. So there'll be no change, but we may have to do an overall schedule change for absolutely everyone if the document is updated. But if no one's taking that deviating, there'll be absolutely no change, no charges, nothing at all for anyone else to have to do.
Thank you. The next one then sits around the timeframes for any reissue of HSG 248 and when that might be.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer this one. So, as I've already said, changing guidance is not straightforward. There's limited time slots available, and you need to know in advance that you need to request one of those time slots. So I spoke to colleagues this morning before this webinar. It'll take months, and it's unlikely to happen this year. So we're talking about 2026 now. Whether that's the beginning or the middle of 2026, I can't say at this moment in time. But it's not going to be something that's going to appear in the next few months. It is going to take probably till at least the end of this year, start of next year.
Can I just touch on that obviously if we do have agreement, and obviously we would need it to be a definite, and that would all be agreed that it would be happening. There is obviously, as soon as HSE are able to, it's a lot more complicated in the background, I appreciate, but as soon as we're able to have something to work to, it doesn't mean that UKAS can't, if this is fully agreed, can't start working towards it before it's published. We cannot put it onto a schedule for a new version until that point, but it doesn't mean we can't work with laboratories and get you ready as soon as possible for that to be out and coincide with that.
Yeah, then we've got a question around whether the inclusion of this deviating method will be mandatory, or whether people will be able to choose not to.
Completely optional. There is no requirement for you to do this at all. You know, if the current process and 2 points is working absolutely fine for your throughputs, there would be no need, there'd be no additional costs, and nothing that you have to do if you don't wish to.
There's one here around it not being the number of points that's the problem, but the time taken to analyse the samples known to be asbestos free. Can you clarify the timing requirements for these types of samples?
So there are changes to the timing. So we're saying for the category A 1 point samples. So this is all in the documentation that should be available on the
website.
Special of Interest, on the UKAS website. So same for the category A, never less than 5 minutes spent on microscope examination of sample. And for the category B, 2 points, never less than 10 minutes. So that will require some other changes in the document just to facilitate that. Because at the moment we say minimum of 15 minutes where no asbestos is detected. So it's not just a case of adding a table. There's a few other cross references that would have to be kind of brought into line with that as well. So there is a recognition that 15 minutes for a no asbestos detected sample is excessive in some cases, or probably in many cases. So yeah, that has been addressed.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. And then I think we've just got the one other question around why can the change not be made through Lab 30? Why is it being done through 248? And I think that's just a matter of policy.
Absolutely. UKAS are the assessors. We're the accreditation body. We accredit to the the guidance, and that is on schedules 248. So we do need that in place. We cannot just do it through a technical bulletin. We do not have the powers or the authority to be able to do that. It must be done through the appropriate channels, as it was with the change to version 2. It now needs to be an update. As I said earlier, though, we will do everything we can to at least get the preparation and at least have this running alongside. And I know HSE will work as quickly as they can to do it, so we can still be doing things to progress this to an appropriate grant as soon as we possibly can on that actual update. But it has to be in that document for us to be able to accredit against it.
Okay, nothing else in the Q&A?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much to HSE for their input through this and for the questions. Just to everyone on this course, as I just want to reiterate, we will be putting this webinar out as a recording. We will be circulating not only, I think, if you register, but trying to get out again to every currently accredited or applying body. We will be sending out and we will share the slides, and we will be able to make this available for you to view. If you do have questions, obviously that you think of in the coming weeks, please contact your assessment manager as the first port of call, and they would be able to contact in through internal contacts to get you any answers on any other questions that come through. Again, the Q&A we're hoping to get up this week as well onto the website, and a reminder, it's the 30th of June, to give you enough time to review the expression of interest. It has the embedded documents and also has an embedded document from UKAS to help guide you through the key clauses that you'd need to consider in 17025. So please do have a look at those to make sure you have an informed decision as to whether you would like to put in an expression of interest. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and for the questions that you've put in, and wish you a good afternoon.